Okay. I'm glad to be joined today by Jeffrey Boutwell. Jeffrey is the author of Boutwell, Radical Republican and Champion of Democracy, which is a fascinating biography of George Boutwell, whose career spanned from 1847 to 1905, if you can believe that. And in the period that he served, he took up many roles, including governor of Massachusetts, U.S. Representative, U.S. Senator, Treasury Secretary, and later in his life, anti-interventionist activist. And throughout all of this as well, he was a major civil rights leader and earlier an abolitionist leader. Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining me today.
Always nice to be with you, Lincoln.
So the book is great. And one of the first things that I thought of while reading it, and I told you this over email, was just how approachable it is for folks who might not be as well versed in that period, because there is, I mean, and for Boutwell, that period, it spans the entire 19th century. But what was your approach to writing this, where you have some biographies of civil rights leaders and of Civil War figures, and they are so dense and hard to get through, where yours is really approachable? What were you trying to balance with that?
Well, thanks for the compliment. It is exactly what I was aiming to try and achieve. I suppose part of it has to do with the fact that I'm just a general lover of history, and that goes back to junior high school and college and graduate school. So when I started writing about George, and my editor got constantly frustrated by this in the early stages of the project, I kept going down rabbit holes of historical events. Well, George was doing this in the 1840s or the 1860s or the 1880s. One example would be Coxey's Army in the 1890s, the famous labor strife against the burgeoning, rise of capitalist industrialist cartels. Coxey's Army marches on Washington. They surround the Capitol, somewhat like January 6th, 2001, in a different context. But I just, I got fascinated with the thought that ordinary Americans, would march from California, from the Midwest, all the way to Washington to protest government policies in the middle of the winter, in many cases, and wanted to write more about it. And especially when I learned that the Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz, many people think is a parable for Coxey's Army, that it related to the economic conditions in the 1890s, that the Yellow Brick Road was actually gold, the gold standard, that Dorothy's slippers, which originally are silver in the book, not ruby, that they represented William Jennings Bryan and the silver standard. Anyway, that the Wizard of Oz was a whole metaphor or parable for the economic conditions in the 1890s. And as you can tell just from this description, I just wanted to talk more and more and more about that in the book. And my editor said, wait a minute, Jeffrey, this is a book about George Boutwell. It's not a book about Coxey's Army or the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Stick to the script and stick to the narrative about George. So that was, I needed that kind of guidance in writing it because, again, I love history and I love going off on, historical tangents.
Yeah, and there are so many historical tangents you could have gone down with Boutwell, and I think that's one of the challenges of a figure like George Boutwell, where his career spans so long, and there's just so many different chunks of American history. We break up history into different periods, and his life spanned so many that you could write 3 biographies, 3 volumes on Boutwell.
Just a small correction. Actually, his career started in 1839. When he was elected postmaster in Groton, Massachusetts, but he also had his first trip to Washington in 1839, and he met Martin Van Buren at the White House. So that was the first president George met, 1839. The last one he came face-to-face with, of course, was Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. And as you say, just imagine, 1839 to 1904, all of the changes that the country had gone through, from pre-Civil War, abolitionism, emancipation, rise of industrial cartels and the Gilded Age, imperialism, American imperialism overseas. George was intimately involved with all of those issues. I will put a little plug in for the book in terms of the historical context in which I was writing, in that, again, with good guidance from my editor, I was able to, I think, give the reader a good sense of what was going on at the time at any point in George's life, and go into the issues a little bit, not down rabbit holes, but go into them a little bit so that the reader had a good sense of what was happening in American history. And certainly one of the nicest comments I ever got about the book was from Robert Putnam, the Harvard sociologist who wrote Bowling Alone, who said that he loved the so-called peripheral vision of the book. That anytime I'm talking about George, there's also the peripheral vision of what's going on at the time, not only in events that he's involved in, but the wider context as well. And I've had people comment on that as well. It's just a wonderful primer almost on American history from the 1840s to the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's framed very well, and Boutwell's life is framed very well, and addition, the details of Boutwell's life are included as well. So it's a mix of both, which is exactly what a reader of this period who might be new to this might be interested in reading. So another thing that I wanted to get into before we actually jump into Boutwell's life was your process in writing this, because you don't come from an historical academic background. You come from an academic background in other subjects. So what was that like, jumping into this post your career in public policy around nuclear weapons and international relations, into history? What was your challenge there, and were there any challenges?
Actually, I guess I would say there wasn't a major challenge. I've always preferred writing for a general audience as opposed to an academic audience. In previous books I wrote on German nuclear weapons or the Israeli-Palestinian Society were very much pitched at being understood by a general audience. They weren't written for academics. So that was just more of the same when I came to writing about George. Certainly, I had to get up to speed in terms of advances in historical research, which I had not undertaken for many, many years. But with the advent of the internet, of course, that is just so much easier than it used to be. I look back at the days when I was at Yale in the early 1970s, and you'd go to the library and you go through microfiche and microfilm, and you'd spend hours in darkened basements and come out with a headache, whatnot, trying to find little snippets in newspapers from 100 years ago. And it just was so time consuming to try and find what you wanted. Now you can get a subscription to newspapers.com. You just plug in the name Boutwell. It will tell you in what newspapers his name appeared. It'll show where it appeared. It's almost as if everything is served up on a plate. Perhaps that makes the problem of, in the other direction. There's so much information. You've got to make sure you're weeding out the chaff from the wheat. But boy, it was just such a wonderful experience to be able to do so much of this online, especially since I started in March of 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, and a lot of that wouldn't have been possible without, during the pandemic, a lot of that time was spent, for my part, doing Henry Wilson research. So, without a lot of these institutions were closed because of the pandemic. Yeah. So having that online was such a positive, and it's, I think that outweighs the cons of not being able to start the Zoom meeting, or the benefits of the tech that we have for that.
Yeah.
So one thing that you kept going back to throughout the book, which I really loved, was kind of flashing back to his farm and the community in Groton. What do you think that part of his life, being a part of growing up working on the farm and having that agricultural background, how do you think that shaped his political outlook and political career?
I often make the connection with Abraham Lincoln, that George did have many similarities with Lincoln in terms of his early life, the first 20, 25 years of his life. He was self-educated. He only went to school, really through the early teens, never went to college, didn't certainly go to law school. Didn't even graduate from high school, but he was self-read and self-educated. He found people to study with, especially good lawyers in Groton in the 1830s that he could learn the law with. And so very much self-educated like Lincoln in terms of uh, intellectual veracity. He wanted to know everything about everything, and was really an intellectual sponge when it came to self-educating himself. Then the second part is just the discipline of hard work. Growing up on a farm, Lincoln splitting rails and having to work for a less than, empathetic father in Kentucky and Indiana before moving to Illinois. George, differently from that, had a wonderful father from whom he learned empathy and tolerance and respect for others, but very much the discipline and the values of hard work, growing up on a farm, then working in our dry goods store, like Lincoln did in Salem, Illinois, and a dry goods store that failed, having to learn the hard lessons of bankruptcy and moving on from that. So many similarities in the first 20 or 25 years of his life. And George just loved the land. He loved what agriculture gave him in terms of the grafting of fruit trees, the growing of crops, the breeding of cattle. It just meant a lot to him, so that even in the 1880s and 90s, when he's 80 years old, he's still president of the Middlesex County Agricultural Society in Groton, Massachusetts. Earlier, he'd come across Henry David Thoreau in that position. And so, like Lincoln, just a man of the land who never lost that quality.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating to look back at I mean, most of these people, most of these historical figures of the past, from Boutwell to Lincoln to, even going further back to some of the founding fathers, and of course Henry Wilson, had this background in labor, and they had such a passion for caring about laborers, often from different parties and different viewpoints, but it came back to experience, and they had a very unique outlook on how to care for the working man, and later working woman. So one thing,
I'll just a quick,
yeah, go
quick
ahead.
addendum to that, of course, which is so rare to find today. You take all the members of Congress, how many of them really know what it's like to run a business, to fail at business, to be in touch with workers on a regular basis, to meet a payroll, to do all of those things? They don't, and they just don't, have the empathy for the common American that Lincoln and Wilson and Boutwell had.
Yeah, and it one of the things that my next question links into is, throughout the book, I was kept thinking this is so similar to today in terms of how our politicians act, and how, the role of parties, and how big parties come and fall, and there's smaller groups, and how they're cast by the main party. And it's so interesting to read back on history. It gives you such a wonderful perspective, especially in this period of both the pre-Civil War and Civil War, and then post-Civil War, because there's so many themes that continue to run through American society and culture and politics today. And one thing that I was thinking was, we have these figures, Boutwell and Wilson, early in their careers, when they're both very ambitious. And one thing we talked about in our last interview several years ago was how they all viewed each other with this sense of suspicion, because they were all very ambitious, politicos. What do you think was special about this group and about Boutwell that made them not just ambitious, but actually override their party and form new parties, where in all other chances, or the likelihood was that they would actually fail? What made them not stick in that political party ladder and try something new, despite what their ambition might have been telling them?
I guess it would have to be the fluidity of politics back in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. Parties were coming and going, the Know-Nothings, the Free Soil Party, the Whigs disintegrating, the Democrats disintegrating over the slavery issue. That party identification or party allegiance just wasn't the same as it is today. They could leave a party and they would find they would be welcome in a new political gathering, and that is just not so possible today. if you're a MAGA Republican, you're not going to leave the Republican Party and expect to be welcomed with open arms by Democrats. So mainly the fluidity of the Democratic Party, but also I think Lincoln and Wilson and Boutwell and others just had a higher regard for principle over politics. They had things they wanted to achieve, and it wasn't through their own self-aggrandizement or their own success in reaching a political position. They were in it to affect change, not for themselves.
And I think it's interesting when we look back on the end of Boutwell's career in life, when he actually, leaves the Republican Party over its move towards interventionalism. Uh, do you think that was kind of old Boutwell coming through and not recognizing that how much politics had changed?
I think he had become kind of so focused and directed at the end of his life on upholding constitutional values. And of course, there's nothing really wrong with that, but that was at the expense of anything else. So that's why, as leader of the Anti-imperialist League, he did tell his supporters, and especially black voters, to not vote for the Republican Party, to not support Teddy Roosevelt because of what Roosevelt was doing in the Philippines and elsewhere against non-white peoples. That he kind of lost the forest for the trees a little bit in terms of, well, fine, if we don't support Roosevelt, who are we going to support? The only alternative are the white Democrats who are controlled by Southern white Democrats who are instituting Jim Crow in the South. And that would be the norm of the Democratic Party for the next 50, 60 years up through the civil rights movement. So it's one thing to tell your supporters, to not support the Republican Party because of what they're doing in the Philippines. But if there's no viable alternative, it's a bit of a lose-lose situation.
Yeah. So what we have, Butwell has a terrific career before the Civil War, and then at the outbreak of the Civil War and during the Civil War, what were Boutwell's priorities? What was he thinking about during the war? What was his activities during the Civil War itself?
Um, George, and I really admired this about him. He, whatever task he was given, that's what he would focus on. And you go from the late 1850s, where at the time he's Secretary of the Mass Board of Education, following in the footsteps of Horace Mann and other, public education reformers who really recognized that for America to be a great nation, we have to have public education available to all. So George is doing that at the end of the 1850s while also founding the Republican Party. But then when the war starts, he's given various jobs by Lincoln and people in the Lincoln administration. He's a delegate to the Virginia Peace Conference at the Willard Hotel in February of 1861, where he maintains the hard line about no extension of slavery into the Western territories. Lincoln is not going to backtrack on that, telling that to the Southern delegates. He then becomes John Andrews' main military liaison between the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the Union government, the national government, right after Fort Sumter and the Baltimore riots, to send Massachusetts troops and material to the government. George is then sent out to Cairo, Illinois, to investigate the workings of the Western War Department, is brought back from that in July of 1862 and made Commissioner of Revenue, the country's very first Commissioner of Revenue, to raise needed funds for the Union war effort. So, four different, very, very different jobs in the first 2 years of the Civil War, all of which he just threw himself into 24/7.
And it's such a chaotic period of American politics, and so many things happened in that decade alone, from 1855 to 1865, that it's so interesting to see how politicians and how government officials like Boutwell, who at some points was very directly involved in the national effort, but also on the state, had state
Mm-hmm.
roles, how they continued their work and continued to serve their mission, regardless of what was happening on the ground and just the chaos happening all around them.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's reassuring in some way that even in periods of chaos and disruption, there are public servants and there are officials who keep working hard on the ground and working in state and local government to serve the people. One thing towards, at the end of the Civil War, um, this was one of my favorite parts of the book, was discussing the assassination of President Lincoln and Boutwell's role in investigating that. Now, at this point, he is a member of Congress. He's a representative, and you tell the story. He leads the committee to investigate the assassination.
When George got his teeth into something, he wouldn't let go. And on this one, he certainly got his teeth in, I think perhaps a bit too much. He became a bit too obsessed with all of the rumors that were floating around and some evidence that Confederate officials in Richmond had been directly involved in aiding the conspiracy of John Wilkes Booth and others against Lincoln. Now, that was true in terms of their Booth's plan to kidnap Lincoln in the spring of 1865. Booth's decision to kill Lincoln was his own. It was not orchestrated by the Confederates in Richmond or by their spy network in Montreal or whatever. But George continued to believe that Jefferson Davis had played a salutary direct role in the assassination of Lincoln, and he really was going to follow the evidence wherever it went. Now, to his credit, at the end, he himself admitted that the evidence wasn't there. As much as he would have liked to have implicated Jefferson Davis in that plot, he did admit that Booth had pretty much acted on his own. But for about a 12-month period, 1865, 1866, he's leading this congressional committee looking into the assassination, and he is just, he's a man on a mission.
And well, at the beginning, Boutwell was believing in or trying to investigate some of these conspiracies about the Confederacy. Towards the end of the investigation and post-investigation, Boutwell was actually the subject of some of the conspiracies around Lincoln's assassination. And one of the things that you write about is there's this briefcase that Boutwell swears to never release the contents of.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about that and just how kind of conspiracies around this issue ran amok around Boutwell?
That box of materials that you're referring to that was deposited in the National Archives is one of the great hanging threads of the book. I was not able to resolve that fully one way or the other. I will say that, conspiracy theories were just as welcome and just as in vogue back then as they are now. They were just flowing all around, even touching Andrew Johnson for a while, that Johnson had a role in Lincoln's death so he could become president. But the one you're referring to centered on Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War, that Stanton had felt that Lincoln would be too lenient against the South, and so he got people like Boutwell and others to join him in this conspiracy to kill Abraham Lincoln so that the South would be duly punished after the war. All of that has been totally debunked as well. As you referenced, George's kind of cryptic remark about these materials that he had gathered as leader of the congressional committee that he put into a box that he said should never see the light of day. Now, he also said they had no bearing on the conspiracy cases he was looking into, which leads you to say, well, so why were they so important? But for some reason, he said they should never see the light of day. Perhaps they were scurrilous information about Stanton in another regard, who knows? But those materials have never been located. And I did contact people at the National Archives who kind of sent me what was available in there. And I thought it was really telling. There was a little handwritten note from early 1950s that another researcher had been in there looking for the same thing and had not been able to find anything as well. So maybe somebody else will come along in the future and unearth what was so important in that box of materials that George said should never see the light of day.
Yeah, I found that to be one of the best parts of the book. And it is so funny how many loose threads we have on history, and especially of this period, just because
Hmm.
of from document keeping to just the chaos going on everywhere in this period. It's funny to think of all the things that we have lost or have yet to be discovered. I
Yeah.
think is a good way to frame it. Um, One thing that you uh, wrote about was um, Johnson, uh, Andrew Johnson, and uh, Boutwell. And there was this period when the radical Republicans were actually somewhat hopeful that Johnson was going to be a successful Reconstruction civil rights president because of
Hmm.
his, flamboyant acts as the military governor, and trying to set free the enslaved people of that area. Uh, what do you think about what do you think Boutwell saw in Johnson that others didn't? Because Boutwell, my impression was that Boutwell was never really supportive of Johnson in any sense.
Hmm. One of the things I'm most proud about in terms of George Boutwell is how early he recognized that Johnson was going to be no friend of congressional reconstruction, no friend of black civil rights in the South. And as you say, even before other radical Republicans like Charles Sumner in particular, it took Sumner many months to come to the same conclusion. Part of it was George had a meeting with Johnson at the end of May of 1865 about what Johnson was doing in North Carolina, reconstituting a Southern white state government in North Carolina with very little safeguards in place for the black citizens of North Carolina. And George came away from that meeting saying he had given Johnson too much room for maneuver, that he had in the end said, okay, I'll go along with it and let's see what happens. Well, very early, very quickly after that, he saw what happened, and that is that Johnson was just interested in reconstituting Southern white governments in the South, getting them back into the Union so they could support him and possibly even his candidacy in the 1868 election. And George really recognized that well before other of his radical Republican colleagues in Congress.
And one thing that you included a quote from Boutwell in the book, just about this period of Reconstruction and of Lincoln's assassination and the what could have been if Lincoln had survived. Boutwell wrote, "Lincoln brought the Constitution in harmony with the Declaration of Independence," end quote. And I think that is just such a wonderful line to summarize the core of what the Civil War was, for America, and what
Mhm.
that Reconstruction period really, how it shaped the Declaration in our understanding of America today.
I'll make 2 points on that. One is that, yes, Lincoln, his Gettysburg Address, his second inaugural address, other addresses as well, including a very famous letter he wrote to a political meeting in Boston in 1859 that George Boutwell chaired at the Parker House Hotel in Boston, where he explicitly talks about instilling the values of the Declaration of Independence into the American Constitution, of updating the Constitution with the concept that all men are created equal. So that was a huge, huge, article of faith for George in terms of Lincoln. And I think his feeling was that although many people think Lincoln would have been, easy on the South after the Civil War, yes, that was Lincoln's hope, that he could be empathetic, that he could bring Southern whites back into the national government. But I fully believe that if Lincoln had lived and been president and he had seen what Southern white governments were doing in the South with their black codes, with suppressing blacks, with making them second-class citizens in 1865, 66, 67, that he would have not been an easy president in terms of Reconstruction in the South. I also wanted to mention, since you brought it up, the Declaration of Independence. I'm involved with a kind of a fun project called Lincoln 250. There's a website, www.lincoln250.org, where members of the Lincoln Group of DC, which I'm a part of, and the Abraham Lincoln Association in Illinois are putting up writings about that Lincoln had written speeches and whatnot, where he explicitly talks about the Declaration of Independence and its importance to the Constitution, to the American experiment in democracy. And of course, that's also relevant in this, the 250th anniversary of America's birth and the Declaration of Independence. So I would urge people to go to www.lincoln250.org to learn more about it.
Yeah, I'll be checking that out as soon as I can. It sounds very fascinating. So for most of the figures of this period, this would be the end of the conversation. But Boutwell went and had the second part, or I don't even know if you could call it that, but an extension of his career at the Treasury Department. So why don't you talk a little bit about Boutwell's legacy in the Treasury?
You're right. George, after being Lincoln's revenue commissioner, 1862-63, he goes into Congress, 63-69, impeachment of Johnson, Reconstruction amendments, 14th and 15th. And just before Grant's inauguration of March of 1869, Grant has to turn to Boutwell to really kind of rescue him because his first choice for Secretary of Treasury had fallen by the wayside. And Grant pleads with Boutwell to take the position, which he really doesn't want to do. He wants to stay in Congress. So you're right. It was very much a kind of a second act, an unexpected second act in his political career. As with everything he did, George threw himself into the position, learned as much as he could. He had good training, being revenue commissioner and governor of Massachusetts. But what he brought to the Treasury Department, in the sprawling, largest department in the U.S. government, especially with the economic recovery the country is going through following the Civil War, he brings competence, transparency, and good management to the U.S. Treasury Department in a pretty much nonpartisan way. Not to say that he didn't favor, Republican officials coming into Treasury, but what he demanded above all was competence. He wasn't going to put no-shows or others on the payroll. And he really organized the Treasury Department. He picked great people to manage different parts of it, like the Revenue Marine Service, the Secret Service, other parts of Treasury, so that in those 4 years, he was able to give the Treasury Department a good grounding with which to aid America's economic recovery following the Civil War.
And he really is one of the ongoing, if we can think of these like kind of ongoing founders of the Treasury Department, where his service in the department kind of reshaped the Treasury into something of similar what it is today. Of course, things changed throughout history as well, but his foundation that he laid has just been built upon is all I could think of when I was reading it, and just how fascinating reflecting on events today are as well. So moving into the last part of his career is the McKinley presidency and his role in advocating against a lot of the movement into the Caribbean and of course, the Spanish-American War. So talk a little bit about Boutwell's view of interventionism and his resistance to that movement.
You talk about George having 3 stages in his career, which he did. Kind of the political one with the Republican Party in the 1850s and 60s, working on civil rights, working on Reconstruction, the Reconstruction amendments, all of that, for which he'd had really good training as a member of the Massachusetts House in the 1840s, much like Henry Wilson did, and then as governor. So a good political apprenticeship that positioned him well to be a leader in the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, in the 1850s and 60s. That's the first stage. Second stage is Treasury Department and his economic management. Well, by the time he comes to be Treasury Secretary, as I mentioned, he'd had good training both as governor of Massachusetts, but also revenue commissioner for Lincoln. So that is good training, economic training, to be a successful Treasury Secretary in 1869. His third stage, working on international law, interventionism, the rights of people overseas, he also had good training for, because in the 1880s and 90s, he concentrates on international law. He becomes a counsel for the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1880s, trying to protect Hawaii's independence from American annexation. He serves on international commissions regarding France, Haiti, and Chile, and others. He really, throws himself into international law in the 1880s and 1890s, so that by the time he's asked to become president of the Anti-imperialist League in 1898, he's got good training and the background to be able to do that job, which he does for the last 7 years of his life until he dies in 1905, still in harness, dies in bed, but protesting the annexationist policies of first McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt, and not only the Philippines, but Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other island possessions that the U.S. gathered into its orbit.
Yeah, and we think of, these elder statesman figures as being, sometimes kind of conservative and giving advice to the younger activists and moving more towards compromise. But throughout his whole career, Boutwell was just such beyond just being a statesman, he was an advocate and an activist,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
that, from abolition all the way to anti-interventionalism, he carried that baton of activism, which I just found such a fascinating part of the book and of Boutwell's life. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak. I could speak with you about Boutwell for hours and hours. And I
Likewise.
encourage, yeah. And one other point about the book is that for folks who might not be used to reading Civil War biographies or just biographies in general, it's broken up in such a great way where you could read, a chapter or just a section and take a pause from it. You don't have to read a whole chapter, especially for our busy lives. It was very easy to read in that sense as well. So thank you so much, Jeffrey Boutwell. Where can people find the book? What's the best place?
Widely available in bookstores and online. And go to www.jeffreyboutwell.com for more information about the book and me and other writings I've done about George. But just Google Boutwell and you'll readily find a book supplier, and do support your local independent bookstore.
Great. Thank you so much.
Good. Thanks, Lincoln. Always a pleasure.